partly because he couldn't read them in fascist jail. So, to this extent, he could let his originality show more in some ways. That doesn't mean he wasn't a Marxist. Being a good Marxist is not, we have learnt it the hard way, being a good Marxist is not just showing how right some past text was. There are two other points I want to make. Firstly, of course, or rather, if you like, fifthly, he came from a country which united the problems of the modern capitalist industrial world, as in Turin, and the modern third world. If you came from Sardinia, you knew what the problems of backwardness and of underdevelopment and all these were. So in a sense, his theory is capable. Indeed, one of the most, for historians, one of the most original bits of Gramsci is precisely the way in which he understands the problems of writing the history of, understanding the problems of, say, a peasant society and highly traditional backward peasant society. And finally, he came from a country which faced more dramatically than any other the basic problem of communists after 1970. Namely, what do revolutionaries do when the revolution they hope to make hasn't happened? More, when, as in Italy, it had failed to take place in spite of the presence of most objective conditions for it, in spite of actually trying to take place, in spite of a revolutionary situation, in spite of the occupation of the factories, it failed. And this implied a second question which he also considered. What happens when an essentially successful Soviet revolution remains isolated in the world? What effect does it have on this isolated socialist society as well as on the rest? Why did the revolution in Europe fail? What do we do now? What is the outlook? What is more, within a few years of being in jail, that initial failure of the revolution in most of Europe was underlined by a second and equally dramatic failure. Capitalism plunged into the great slump, which was probably the only genuinely system-endangering economic crisis that we've had in the history of capitalism, and it led not, as many people thought it was going to be, to an immediate upsurge of revolution, but in the short run to the triumph of international fascism and a number of other things. And in fact, it was very typical that it was between 1929 and 1933 that Gramsci was in fact doing most of his writing. Now, all Gramsci's thinking is, of course, determined by this major question. Let me take as an example the term hegemony, which is a key idea in Gramsci. Now, he pretty certainly took this term over from Lenin, who didn't invent it because it had been current coin in the debates of the Russian revolutionaries for years. But for Lenin, for instance, in his two tactics of social democracy, which I think is where Gramsci got it from, hegemony meant the willingness of the peasantry to follow the lead set by the working class, as it were. He saw it in terms of the advance of the revolution. The Gramscian term, quite apart from being more elaborate, is essentially used to explain not just what the workers have got to do to get forward, but also why it is so difficult to overthrow capitalism. See, why capitalism appears to be so resistant even in a period of revolutionary crisis. Now, the specific background of Gramsci's thought, the need to rethink our position in the light of a historical failure, naturally tends to make Gramsci congenial to people who operate in analogous conditions, and who therefore also have to do a bit of rethinking of what to do at a time when hopes have not been realized. For the left in general, and the British left in particular, we do face an analogous problem. And nothing is more useless than to deny a setback or a defeat. What's the use of talking about, what was the use of talking about 8.5 million who were said to have voted for socialism in 1983, as Tony Benn did? Not that the 8.5 million did vote for socialism in any real sense, when the reality was that Labour had lost more than a quarter of its supporters. What's the use of concentrating on the heroism of the miners' 12-month struggle, which is absolutely undoubted, when the reality is also that of a union led into division and defeat by bad or wrong generalship, which overrode the advice of some communist miners' leaders, whose qualifications as left-wingers and as union leaders were as good as those of the people who actually set the strategy. Nothing is more useless than to talk as though the workers were still what they were in 1950. And the whole essence of Gramsci is that he started off by saying, right, what we had hoped for hasn't happened now. Where do we go? But in fact, of course, the value of Gramsci's thinking lies not only in suggesting the need for new strategic perspectives for a movement which failed to make headway with the old ones. This, incidentally, doesn't mean that we treat the present situation in any significant sense as similar to the one in which Gramsci lived. Nobody today should or could claim the textual authority of Gramsci for their policies. And I myself have, even 10 years ago, said that it is totally wrong to regard Gramsci as a Euro-communist, before his time. It would have been absolutely senseless to introduce the situation of the 1970s, whatever we think of it, into the situation of the 20s and 30s in which Gramsci wrote. So it's irrelevant to speculate what Gramsci would have been today. That isn't the business. It's how we should think about the problem. The interest in Gramsci is indeed broader than the strategic one. In fact, he suggests new strategic perspectives because he has added new, or at least emphasized previously neglected dimensions of Marxist thinking. And I shall mention some of these. I'll deliberately not say anything much about what Gramsci can contribute to our economic analysis, because he wasn't primarily an economic thinker or analyst, even though, as I say, one of his closest friends with whom he exchanged important opinions, namely Sraffa, was an economist and an extremely distinguished one, and they corresponded on this matter. The main emphasis of his thought was always, and is always imbued with history, was political and social and cultural. Even so, it will not do to underestimate his contribution even in the economic field, because he was one of the first communist thinkers to come to terms with what he recognized, even in the late 20s, as a new phase of capitalist development. More than just, as most communists and most socialists thought, a temporary, quote-unquote, temporary stabilization of the same old capitalism. And in his writings on Americanism and Fordism, which really in some instances show at his most original, he recognized this, and these writings do repay reading for that for that reason. At the very least, he does remind us that capitalism doesn't just work or break down under what are essentially the same internal contradictions, but that its capacity to survive and flourish is based on a high degree of adaptability and capacity to change. But unfortunately, in this respect, he doesn't any longer tell us anything that we need to be told. We have learned that this is so. The fact that, for instance, we have been for 10 years or more living in a major global capitalist crisis, analogous, at least as serious in its way as the one in the 30s, and nobody any longer seriously argues as though the imminent collapse of the system is immediately round the corner, shows that to this extent we no longer expect, we are no longer as simple-minded in our expectations. A lot